whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. When the disciples heard it, they fell on their face and were sore afraid. Jesus came and touched them and said, Arise and be not afraid. And when they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no man save Jesus only. I think it was this morning, I started with Peter. We'll look at James tonight. And then next week we will pick the third of the inner circle of Christ, which is John. But we really don't know as much about James as we do many of the other apostles or even disciples. Sometimes we have to take what's said, put it with other scriptures, and sometimes we have to look at what is not said as well as what is said. Then we can draw some logical conclusions about who and what a certain anybody or anything was. I want to look very briefly at James. And as we come to an end, I want to hopefully glean some thoughts for you and me. First of all, who was this man named James? We know that he was the brother of John. So there was Peter, James, and John. Peter was a brother to John. Some people think he was a half-brother to Christ, but I think because his name is James. But if you study, there are several Jameses in the New Testament, and if you really study, that idea just didn't hold water when you really looked at it close. But we do know from Matthew 13:15, Jesus had a brother or a half-brother named James. Matthew 13:55, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? By the way, James and John's mother was also named Mary. That's where, again, some people get them mixed up. But is not his mother called Mary, talking about Jesus, and his brethren, James and Jose and Simon and Judas? So those people who say that Mary was a virgin when she conceived, she was a virgin after she gave birth, and she remained a virgin for her entire life, have never read the Bible. Because it clearly says, is not this the carpenter's son? His mother is Mary, and his brothers are James, Jose, Simon, and Judas. Later on, we also find out that Jesus had some sisters or half-sisters. So there's no way possible that Mary was a virgin after the birth of Christ, nor that she remained a virgin for the rest of her life. Like Peter, he was a fisherman. And as I said, in thinking about Peter, to be a fisherman, it was not like me. You throw in a reel or throw in a line and just sit there. It was hard work, very hard work. We know he was a fisherman because in Mark 1:19, when he had gone a little further thence, talking about Jesus, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who also were in the ship mending their nets. So James was a fisherman, very, very much like Peter. In fact, Luke chapter 5 tells us that James and John were partners with Peter in the fishing industry. History doesn't tell us much, but Peter, James, and John worked for two of them's father. He owned the ship, and they fished with their father, but they were in partnership with Simon Peter, who was also in the inner circle. So before they ever followed Christ, there was a common bond between Peter, James, and John. They were all fishermen. They all worked on the same boat. They worked together. They were called together. So they already had this bond. What type of person was James? And until I studied this, I never paid any attention whatsoever. But whenever you read and it mentions James and John, James's name is always first. It's always James and John. James and John. Some folks think that indicates that James was the older of the two, and so he was given preference. But if you study it out, now sometimes it'll just say the sons of Zebedee, but when it gives their names, James is always mentioned first, which is funny after I saw it, because who was the disciple that Jesus loved? Don't answer, but how many of you know the disciple whom Jesus loved? One. Come on, Bill, I know you know. Two, the disciple that Jesus loved was John. But his brother James is always mentioned first. Just throw that in. Jesus named James and John sons of thunder. Mark 3:17, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, and he surnamed them Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder. The name, sons of thunder, and I got this from Strong's Concordance, sons of thunder seems to denote that they were fiery and had a fiery and destructive zeal that made them like a thunderstorm that comes in, blows everything down, destroys things, and just leaves a devastation behind. Because in that account, they went to Samaria and they said, Jesus is coming. And the Samaria turned them aside because it said Jesus had set his face to go to Jerusalem, and Samaria said, if he's going to go to Jerusalem, we're not going to invite him to just stop by. So James and John go back to Jesus and want to call down fire and hailstones and destroy them. They wanted to devastate the city. They wanted to literally, like a mighty storm, blow in, blow everything apart, call fire down, destroy the city, because they didn't do what they thought they should have done. Now, if you're thinking ahead, you already put two and two together. How many times have you wished you could just call fire and hail down and destroy somebody because they didn't do something you thought they should have done? Now, I try, my wife has encouraged me not to use personal references, but in this case, I'm going to use my brother. I get probably average about 6 calls a day, And out of those calls, somebody broke in and stole my Cokes. Somebody stole my cereal. Somebody stole my watch. Somebody stole this. And then after he tells me what they stole, he says, I hope they get cancer. I hope they die suffering. And he'll go on and on and on. One time he wished he could knock them in the head with a hammer. Another time he wanted fire to strike them or lightning. You know, he's got advanced dementia, so I kind of look over him. But I know people who don't have any sickness. They get mad about something. I wish they would just fall dead. Well, that was James and John. Or they didn't invite us in. What do you want us to call hell and fire down and just destroy them? Now, let's bring it down a little bit closer. Have you ever been behind somebody that you just wished you could run over them? Same concept. They're not doing what I think they should. I wished I could just run over them. Or, I don't do this very seldom, but I get it done to me a lot. Beep, 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 get off the road, you idiot. Or, I told someone yesterday, I really feel sorry for some of these people. Apparently, they had some kind of a major accident, and it cut off 3 fingers and a thumb, and they're left with 1 finger to wave at me. I really feel sorry for them because their hand was somehow crippled because all they ever wave is just 1 finger that's left. Because I drive the speed limit 99% of the time. And they'll fly up behind me. I won't go into that, but I had to warn a car last night to get off my bumper. I could have kicked his headlights out from sitting on my back bumper. It's like, get out of the way! I'm doing the speed limit. Well, they were not very happy with me. Sons of thunder, let's call hell and fire down and destroy them. I bet quite a few of you have thought that at some time or other. For some reason, he and John thought that they should be more privileged than the other apostles. Now, Matthew gives one account, Mark gives another account, and if you read Matthew and then read Mark, it sounds like they contradict each other. Matthew says, in Matthew 20:20, then came to him the mother of Zebedee's children with her sons, worshiping him and desiring a certain thing of him. And if you've read it, you know that she asked Jesus, I want 1 son to sit on your right hand and 1 son to sit on your left hand. But when you read Mark, it says, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came unto him, saying, Master, we would that thou shouldest do for us whatsoever we desire. And they said, I want to sit on the right, the other one can sit on the left. So was it the mother of Zebedee's children, or was it the children of Zebedee? I think it was probably both. The mother went and perhaps planted the idea, and then James and John said, Mom suggested that. How about that, Jesus? Can one of us sit on your right and one of us on your left? Or, depending on how you read Matthew and Mark, it may have been James and John first, then their mother came along. But either way, their mother wanted them, one on the right hand of the throne, the other, and the two boys thought that they should be one on the right, one on the left. You ever felt you deserved better than you're getting? Lord, I'm so much better than everybody else. When we get to heaven, I expect you to introduce me to the millions of people and say, this is my favorite son, Wilbert Ellis. I don't think that, but you probably think something serious, something similar. You go to an awards banquet and it's like, I deserve this reward better than anybody. I think in this particular instance, James and John had just a teeny little bit of pride, and it caused a tremendous amount of jealousy with the other 10 apostles. So in order to teach all of them a lesson, Jesus took a little child and said, anybody that wants to be chief must come as a little child. Children, when they're born, are not necessarily born proud. They're not born thinking, they're in the hospital, in the baby room. They're not laying there thinking, I'm better than that baby in the crib next door. Children are not born with pride, but as we get older, we tend to think that somehow we're better than we really are. Paul warned of this. He said, let no man think more highly of himself than he ought to think. Because when you start thinking more highly of yourself than you ought to think, it's about 150% sure you have a pride problem. That was the problem when Jesus washed the disciples' feet. The master, the teacher, the Son of God, the creator of the universe, washed the disciples' feet. In the lesson, he said, I did this as an example. You're not too good to do anything. If the master of the universe, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the creator of the universe, could stoop to wash feet, you think you're better than Christ? You think you're better than God? No, we have to become as a little child. In spite of everything, James was very blessed. Of all of the disciples, and on the day of Pentecost, there were 120 disciples that met with the 11 apostles up in the upper room. And we know that there were many more thousands of disciples. And out of all of those disciples, Jesus called James, called him out. And I thought, to be called by Christ is a tremendous blessing. The fact that God called me in salvation is beyond imagination. He called him. Then not only did he call him, but he called him into special service. I preached Wednesday on what do you have? Not everybody is called to preach. Not everybody can sing. Not everybody can play the piano. Not everybody is equipped to teach. And so Jesus called James and then set him apart as an apostle. What a blessing. Did you ever stop and think what a blessing it is that God saved you? And it's a tremendous blessing that God has used you in whatever way He uses you. I marvel. The older I get, the more I marvel. The more I learn about myself, the more confounded I become. I stand amazed that God would save me. I stand amazed that God would call me, put me into the ministry. I stand amazed that God would give me people who, most of the time, love the Lord, love His service, love the church, and want to serve. You know, as a pastor, I'm just amazed. One of the things I enjoy about conferences is getting to talk to other pastors. And after talking to several of them, we don't have a problem in the world at our church. We don't have a single problem compared to what some of them are going through. But what a privilege. God called you to teach. That's a privilege. God called you to preach. That's a privilege. Not everybody, of all the disciples, not everybody was called to be an apostle. Only 12. 12, 1 and 2. Only 12 were separated and called to be an apostle. Not only that, but of all the 12 apostles, Jesus chose Peter, James, and John to be in His inner circle. He's got the 12 apostles, but and those were with Him night and day. He was constantly teaching them. But out of all of the 12 apostles, only Peter, James, and John were brought into the inner circle. In my early young life as a pastor, I was taught by a preacher that back then we were very close back then. He was a much older preacher, been pastoring for millions and millions of years, and I was just starting out, First Church, just learning everything new. And he called me aside and said, one of the things you need to learn as a pastor is never know your people personally, and never let them know you. He made a great point as pastor. You stay totally separated from the people. And I thought that, I was young. He said you cannot allow the members to get to know you, other than when you're preaching or when you're visiting the hospital. And even that, you keep it very short, very impersonal, and very professional. Later, as I got much older, I listened to what Jesus said rather than him. Jesus said, I am the shepherd. Peter refers to him as the great shepherd, and we are the under shepherds. Jesus said, I know my sheep, and I called them by name. Well, wait a minute. That's not what I was told. And I began to think, wait a minute. Jesus spent lots of time with the apostles, and he spent lots more time with Peter, James, and John. By that definition that I was taught, Jesus should have kept himself aloft from the disciples, and he should have never, ever had an inner circle of apostles. As I got much older, I read there in John over and over, I know my sheep. I know my sheep. I call them by name. So Jesus made sure he knew the sheep, knew their names. And again, how can you minister to people that you don't even know? How can you minister to people that you have no idea who they are? In some of the larger churches, the pastor doesn't even know that you're a member or not. Go to one of these larger churches. Well, you don't go, but ask someone who does go, does your pastor know you? You know, there's 10,000 people. Does your pastor know you? Are you kidding? No. If you go to the hospital and call for the pastor, you'll probably get an associate or a deacon, but you're not likely to get the senior pastor. He doesn't know. Now, I told someone the other day that my memory is not quite as sharp as it used to be. I don't remember I'll remember it, but it may be tomorrow before I remember it. Do you ever do that? Yeah. But how can you pastor 5,000, 10,000 and know my sheep? And I called them by name. So Jesus taught us by example that you do get close to your people. You do get to know them. And then Paul went even farther, and he said in 1 Thessalonians 5:12, we beseech you, brethren, to know them which labor among you. Notice they labor among you, and are over you in the Lord, and admonish them. Jesus said, as a shepherd, you know your sheep. As sheep, you know them which labor among you, and are over you in the Lord, and who admonish you. I remember a particular pastor invited my wife and I. We were green, just moved, starting a brand new work, and he invited us over to his house for supper one night. No big deal. Some of his members found out and came and said, is it true he invited you to supper at his house? I said, yeah, what's the big deal? They said, we've been members here for 20, 25, 30 years, and we've never been allowed to set foot in his house, let alone eat in his house. And I thought, there's something wrong with that. How can I minister to you when I don't know what you're going through? How can I encourage you when I don't know what you're going through? And if you call me up and say, Brother Ellis, this is so-and-so, Who are you? Well, I'm a member of the church there at Grace. I did get a call here a while back. Some guy said, yeah, he said, I'm a member of your church. And I said, you are? He said, yeah. Yeah, I said, what's your name? He told me, and I said, I've been here 30 years, and I've never heard that name before. You sure you got the right church? Yeah, Grace Baptist Church. I'm a member there. To this day, I have no idea who that guy was. 30 years, I've never heard his name, never met him, don't know anything about him. But in many churches, that's their method of operation. You walk in, you sit down, you don't even know the person sitting beside of you. How can we function as a body when I'm sitting next to someone and I have no idea if they're a member, visitor? There was a church up in Cincinnati that had the reputation, they ran 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. They had the reputation, if you ever go there, you better look saved, because if you don't look saved, they're going to get you down the aisle before you get out. They don't even know each other. Jesus knew Peter, James, John, and the other apostles. He knew them by name. He knew their weaknesses. He knew their strengths. He knew what they were capable of and what they were not capable of. Peter, James, and John were in the inner circle. Why did God choose those three? You know what? He didn't tell us why, but he did. Moving it up to our day and time, let's be perfectly honest. Some people are just easier to like than others. Some people, you just like them the first time you meet them. You click, something clicks, and you just like them the first time you meet them. Others, first time you meet them, it's like, where's the back door so I can get away from this? I bet you have people that you like better than other people. It's natural, it's human. Why did Jesus pick Peter, James, and John? What was special about them? Well, my answer to anything like that is God is sovereign. James witnessed the transfiguration. Of all of the 12 apostles, only Peter, James, and John were chosen to go up on the Mount of Transfiguration and watch Jesus be transformed, take back a portion of the glory that he had in heaven. Only Peter, James, and John were privileged to see Moses and Elijah. Did you ever wonder what the other 9 apostles thought? They're down below the mountain, down there below somewhere. And it's like, who appointed Peter, James, and John chief? Who do they think they are getting to go first? What right do they have to see Jesus transformed and we don't? You know, I've read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John dozens and dozens of times. I don't find a single word about them being jealous. If it's there, I have missed it. James was chosen to go with Jesus into the garden. He left all of the disciples and apostles back here. He took Peter, James, and John up here, and he left them, and then he went a little farther, and there he prayed, if it be possible, Lord, let this cup pass from me. But why did they get to go farther? Well, James was eventually killed by Herod the king. Died a martyr's death. because he dared to stand when it wasn't popular. What about us? James, as far as we can tell, was not loud and boisterous like Peter. He just plugged away, plugged away, plugged away, and served Christ. He had his faults, as we all do, and yet God used him most abundantly. He would be like people today who just serve God faithfully, day in, day out, day in, day out. They just serve God. Peter was out front talking. James had very little to say. And yet God used him and used him and blessed him beyond our imagination. You may be like James. Some of you I know are more like James, certainly more like James than Peter. You don't say a whole lot, but you just keep plugging away. Day after day, week after week, you just keep plugging away. You're not loud. You're not up front with everything. You just keep going and going and going and going and going. You're like that bunny rabbit that just keeps on going and going and going. There are a lot of Christians like James. You won't hear much out of them. They just keep serving, keep serving, keep serving, and keep serving. The amazing thing is God used Peter, but God also used James. Personalities totally different. And as I said last week, it's not about personality. It's how faithful are you? How committed are you? How dedicated are you in the things of God?